Wolves in Colorado. Why are they on the ballot, and why do we need them? On November 3rd of this year, Coloradans will have a historic opportunity to restore a natural, balanced Colorado by restoring gray wolves to the state. Proposition 114 asks Coloradans to direct Colorado Parks and Wildlife to restore gray wolves by December of 2023, and to manage those wolves with best science as a non-game species. This video program and episode of the Peak Environment podcast is courtesy of Pikes Peak Group of Sierra Club. I'm Dave Gardner with the Studio 809 Podcast Collective, home to over a dozen podcasts originating at the foot of Pikes Peak. With me today to discuss Proposition 114 are Rob Edward, President of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, the issue committee established to run the campaign for Proposition 114. He's been working toward the eventual return of gray wolves to Colorado for over 20 years. Delia Malone, the wildlife chair for the Colorado chapter of the Sierra Club, is an ecologist who has worked conducting biological surveys on Colorado's West Slope for over 20 years. And Mike Phillips, a senior advisor to the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund. He is a state senator from Montana and a biologist who's worked on wolf recovery and conservation since 1980. All right, so let's get this party started. Why are we voting on wolves in Colorado?
Yeah, I'd like to say that we're voting on wolves in Colorado because the government entities like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have given up on us. And the only way that we can get wolves back to Colorado is by the vote of the public.
Well, that pretty much sums it up for sure. I think that the details there are really down in the policy weeds, but the fact is that the Wildlife Commission that runs wildlife management in this state, like every other Western state, is pretty focused on creating things that you can hunt and fish, but not so focused on conservation of species that aren't necessarily as easy to deal with. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, so Dave, I would only add that while Delia's correct and Rob's correct, the beauty of Proposition 114 is it makes it a decidedly local issue. Rather than Coloradans being told by the long arm of Washington, D.C. and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service what their future will be, Coloradans have the opportunity to decide for themselves the future of their vast public wildlands in the western half of the state. Proposition 114 really simply is an opportunity to establish an aspiration. We aspire for gray wolves to be part of the future. If that's what you believe and you vote yes on 114, the proposition makes clear that the rest of the work is done by the best science assembled by biologists working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. If this approach, employing direct democracy to restore the wolf, if this approach is not a slice of Americana, then I don't know much about mom, apple pie, and baseball.
I'd like to jump in there and add that the folks that don't want to see wolves restored to Colorado often call this management idea, this ballot proposition, ballot box biology. And I just want to say really clearly that the public is deciding to use best science. The public is not deciding that we're going to manage by everything by a vote. We're going to manage by using best science to guide that management of gray wolves. So I think it's really important to understand the distinction between the so-called ballot box biology and the public directing an entity to use best science to manage gray wolves.
It's a beautiful approach. It hasn't been employed elsewhere. This is historic, but it allows Coloradans to develop a wolf restoration plan for Colorado by Coloradans that is predisposed to succeed based on the best science. It really is hard if you believe in our system of government it's really hard to fault the approach. You may choose to vote no, but boy, it's hard to truly fault the approach being employed by the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund and all of the others who are advocating on behalf of Proposition 114 as a way to restore the wolf, to restore the balance.
And ultimately, this is an expression of logic after doing 20 plus years of due diligence to get the issue before the biologists in the Parks and Wildlife Department. There's simply no other way to look at it but that the people of Colorado have said time and again over the last 20 years, we want wolves. We believe that wolves are part of our future as they were part of our past. And the science has always said that Colorado, especially Western Colorado, can support a very robust population of wolves. It's time to get on with that.
You guys may have noticed me getting distracted. I just watched a bear cub walk down my driveway and cross the street.
Nice. Very
right
nice.
in the middle of the day.
Great.
So that doesn't happen every day.
Very cool. Very
yeah.
nice.
So, but we know that several wolves have been observed in northwestern Colorado. So why is restoration even necessary?
Mike, I'm going to punt that.
Yeah, Dave, quite simply, a few wolves does not a population make. An individual here and there in the distant past, in the current time frame, does not a population make. Here's what we know about gray wolves, Dave. When they get into an area and establish themselves, their presence is obvious. They're big animals, 60, 70, 80, 90 pounds. They're relatively easy to see. They leave big tracks on the road. They poop on the road. They howl at the moon. They're exceedingly social, so they tend to occur in a group. They're not subtle. They're pretty obvious. There is no evidence of reproductive activity in the state of Colorado. What we know is that the individuals that have wandered in over the last 15, 20 years, with few exceptions, have either known to have been killed or disappeared without a trace. And so you say, well, why is it the gray wolves aren't getting there on their own? Well, there's three, really not complicated. First and foremost, it's a long walk from northwestern Wyoming to west central Colorado. In the northern Rocky Mountains, a gray wolf on average disperses about 60 miles. Well, that's a pretty big walk, but it certainly doesn't get you from the Yellowstone ecosystem to west central Colorado. The landscape that they have to walk through, the habitats they walk through, are relatively open, and consequently they're relatively easy to see. That's not good for a gray wolf. That makes it easier for them to kill. If they can be seen, they can be killed. And then finally, across about 88% of the state of Wyoming, gray wolves are legally considered a predatory species where they can be killed anytime, day or night, any time of the year, in any numbers, and left in the field. In other words, they have no value. They are subjected to a killing field. And consequently, the potential for enough gray wolves to wander into Colorado, find one another, give rise to a population is very, very, very slight. The most certain, the most humane, the most cost-effective way to restore gray wolves to the vast, highly suitable public wildlands of western Colorado, to restore the balance, is to conduct reintroductions. And when you think about that, Dave, that's not a big deal, pal. That we've done it elsewhere. We've done it in northern Rockies. We've done it in the Southwest. We're not talking about large numbers of wolves being reintroduced. It would only take a few dozen, 30, 40 wolves being released in Colorado properly over the course of a year or two or three. That is a sufficient seed to give rise to a viable population. Natural recolonization by wandering wolves is a pipe dream. It's a red herring argument that's offered by people that I believe really don't want wolves, but are not willing to express their true desires. They would rather have you believe, oh, well, I'm okay with wolves, but they have to get here on their own, knowing full well they will not do so in sufficient numbers to give rise to a viable population.
Exactly.
I'd like to add to something that Mike brought up in his talk there, this concept of restoring a balance. And it's one of the things that we talk about quite a bit. We haven't had a ecologically functional population of wolves in Colorado since, 1900, 1920. It's going to take a long time to undo the damage and the degradation that has occurred over that 100+ years. We need to get enough wolves well distributed throughout Colorado for a sufficient period of time for any sort of balance to be able to begin to be restored. It's not going to happen all of a sudden. It's not going to happen overnight. It took a long time to undo those connections. It'll take a long time to bring them back, but beginning the restoration with a viable population, like Mike said and that Rob mentioned, begins with an active restoration so that, yeah, we got a few little wolves up there in Moffat County. Those few little wolves that amazingly enough managed to survive across the red desert of Wyoming and make it into Colorado. Good for them, but boy, it's taken them 25 years to do that. We need to enhance them. We don't need to leave them hanging out there on their own. And now would be an ideal time to enhance and enable those few little wolves that made it.
And Dave, let me add that this notion of few little wolves in Moffat County, what we know from the state of Colorado is there's not been an abundance of evidence that they're still there, which is intriguing only because if you understand gray wolves, as I said earlier, they're not subtle. They're pretty obvious. Consequently, if they're in an area with any regularity, they leave sign that's relatively easy to interpret. I find it intriguing that the Colorado Parks and Wildlife is not reporting on a lot of evidence, physical evidence, tracks and scats and photographs that confirm their continued presence. For all I know, for all we know, they're dead and gone. Who knows? So I think it's a red herring argument. Moreover, if you believe wolves deserve a place in the wilds of western Colorado, there's one certain way to bring that about, and that's through reintroductions. And please, I want folks to understand, you're not talking large numbers of animals, just a few dozen, 30, 40, 50. And they would give rise in rather short order to a viable population. And when we say viable, we probably are meaning, well, at least 100 wolves, maybe something on the order of 250. That would be a better number for defining viability. All of this is well known. Gray wolves are one of the most intensively studied large mammals in North America. We've done a lot of this work over the last 20, 25 years. Scientists know how to do this and do it well.
So besides scat on the road, what else can we expect in Colorado? What has happened in those areas where wolves have been restored?
Well, they haven't been restored, Dave. There's no restoration effort underway in the state of Colorado. As I said earlier, over the last 20 years, a handful of animals have been known to wander in. Nearly all of them have either disappeared without a trace or they have been known to be killed. The most recent exciting development was a group of 6 wolves in the northwestern corner of the state. There was some evidence of their presence, and then there wasn't, and then there was some more evidence of their presence, and now there isn't. So you're really hard pressed to know what's going on with those guys. And then interestingly enough, there's one other wolf that came out of Wyoming, a black individual, I believe, wears a radio collar that's still functional. The state has done some radio tracking. They have relocated that animal on a few occasions anyway. Sometimes they've seen that animal. And notably, Dave, they've always seen the animal either alone or in proximity to coyotes. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because gray wolves are supremely social. They do not like being alone. They're very good at finding one another. If there were other wolves in the area, that black wolf would know it, and he would go out of his way to be part of their group. That's what wolves do. They're supremely social. That he's by himself or hanging out with coyotes tells us a lot.
But Mike, I think Dave's original question was more broadly, what can we expect based on what science tells us about other restoration areas where wolves have been put
Yeah,
in?
in other states like Montana.
Can we
It's a great question and easily answered. You can expect great success. Oh my gosh, Dave, the four of us in this little Zoom call right now, we could run the show. We could translocate 30, 40 gray wolves from Montana. Animals, by the way, that would be killed otherwise. You could give a wolf that's about to be killed in Montana a new lease on life by translocating it to Colorado. You let it go. Now, you did that with 39, 40 other animals. So you're letting 30, 40, 50 go. They would find one another in groups, and they would stay together, and they would rather quickly give birth to puppies. You could imagine puppies being born in the first spring. So let's imagine that the Colorado Parks and Wildlife released 20 gray wolves in early winter of 2023, November of 2023. You could expect puppies on the ground in March or April of 2024, and you could expect, Dave, within 10 years, the handful of wolves that you had released, 20, 30 animals released, brought down from Montana, within a decade or so, they would give rise to a population of 100 wolves and growing in the direction of something like 250 within the first 15 or so years. If gray wolves are given access to good habitat, good secure habitat, which is Western Colorado, they will take care of the rest. It's important for everybody to note, there's only ever been one thing, just one thing that's ever given gray wolves grief, that's ever made gray wolves endangered, just one thing: human-caused mortality. If people just leave them alone, they are really quite easy to live with, and they do quite well.
So Delia, playing off of where Mike just went, what then would you expect the ecological realities to look like?
Again, important to have enough wolves.
Sure.
That are well distributed. We're not talking one or two, but enough wolves to be ecologically effective. All over Western Colorado, what I've seen in my surveys over the last couple of decades is a decline in aspen woodlands and in riparian woodlands for a variety of reasons, but to do with overpopulation of elk and an overpopulation or mismanagement, I should say, of livestock. And what we can point to numerous places, specifically, for instance, Rocky Mountain National Park, where wolves have been missing since 1910 or so, and elk were reintroduced there without an apex predator to move them around. And we see there used to be a large, gorgeous, big wetland called Beaver Meadows that was resplendent with this beautiful complex of beaver ponds with waterfowl and fish and amphibians. Well, in a few short decades, overpopulation of elk basically ate all those willow. The river's downcut down to its base. The willows died, the beaver left, and now we have a dry, eroding, dusty, pretty much bare meadow. So what we could, if we can get enough wolves back and they're protected from human impacts, as Mike mentioned, we could see a restoration of places like those willow cars. And with those willow cars come the birds and the beaver and the myriad of other species that are, those are willow cars and aspen are our two most diverse, species diverse habitats in Colorado. It's two of our most important habitats in Colorado for elk and for deer. We could see, and again, over time, this isn't going to happen in 5 years. It took a long time for the degradation to happen. It's going to take some time for restoration. But what we could see, and what we will see, if we can get wolves back and get them in sufficient numbers and widely distributed, we will begin to see a restoration of those really critical, important habitats.
Are there other wildlife impacts that you haven't mentioned already?
Well, I think one thing that is interesting to think about, going off what Delia was just describing, is could there be a connection between the presence or absence of wolves in the landscape and the quality of blue ribbon trout streams in Colorado? I would argue, in the big picture, absolutely. Absolutely. We get wolves back on the landscape in sufficient densities across a broad enough portion of western Colorado, and our blue ribbon mileage of stream bed is going to go up.
And that, Dave, is quite simply that if gray wolves put enough pressure on ungulates, deer and elk, that can reduce pressure on streamside vegetation. That allows for more shade allows for cooler water allows for more trout and a more robust fishery. So those are the interesting ecological effects. I would point out, in this age of the COVID-19 pandemic, gray wolf predation also has great potential to arrest the spread of chronic wasting disease. Now we all know that CWD is a problem for deer and elk herds in the state of Colorado. We know that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is advocating for a management scheme to arrest the spread of CWD that calls for actions that would be very, very similar to the consequences of wolf predation. In other words, wolves could be a great proxy for achieving some of the ends that CPW would desire for chronic wasting disease. Now let's think about CWD as a zoonotic disease. A zoonotic disease, Dave, is just a disease that goes from an animal, excuse me, to a human. Coronavirus is now is a zoonotic disease that's caused COVID-19, and it's become a worldwide pandemic. Now, interestingly enough, the lethality rate of COVID-19 is notable, but it's still modest at 3, 4, 5%. In contrast, oh, Dave, chronic wasting disease is always fatal, always fatal. And we know from the scientific studies that CWD has a greater than 0% probability of becoming a zoonotic disease. We also know that you can't tell from the deer or elk that you just shot whether it's a CWD positive animal. There's no way to look at it, know for sure. The only way to know for sure is to have the animal tested. Some people choose to eat meat from a CWD positive animal, but it is important to note that the CDC and the World Health Organization both recommend that meat from CWD positive animals not be consumed. We know that macaques, an important proxy for humans in lab studies, have contracted CWD from infected meat, which gives us this notion that the potential for CWD to become a zoonotic disease is greater than 0. So if you're concerned about zoonotic diseases and you're concerned about chronic wasting disease, why would you not celebrate the potential for the gray wolf to help you arrest the spread and distribution of this important disease? It is a very important benefit that could arise from wolf restoration.
Wow, had no idea.
So, Dave, most folks don't know about this connection, but here's why is the connection so certain? Gray wolves are a coursing predator. They chase things down, and they find prey that they can kill by testing herds, and they test by chasing. They're a coursing predator in contrast to something like a cougar that's an ambush predator. Well, we know from good studies that cougars differentially select for prey that are CWD positive. Now think about this for a moment. If you're an ambush predator, you're not so much concerned about the health of the prey animal because you're going to sneak up on it and gain advantage by being sneaky. Gray wolves don't gain advantage by being sneaky. Gray wolves gain advantage by being determined and running in numbers and constantly testing. And even though they're good at running in numbers and they're determined and they're good at testing, they still come up empty-pawed 7, 8 times out of 10. Gray wolves really are only able to kill animals that are somehow predisposed to predation. Chronic wasting disease would clearly predispose a prey animal to predation. Any predator like the gray wolf that selects for disease-compromised prey will help arrest the seriousness of chronic wasting disease. It makes no sense to me that big game hunters aren't applauding Brother Wolf as a way to handle this most insidious, dangerous, increasingly difficult and challenging disease in the deer and elk herds of Colorado.
Well, there is one other, kind of major concern that we wouldn't be doing the subject justice if we didn't address, and that's this fear about impact on livestock. What has actually happened? What have areas experienced that have reintroduced wolves in terms of livestock impacts?
The data there are clear too, from the Great Lakes states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, which support 6,000 gray wolves, and Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, which supports 2,000 gray wolves. What is true, it's the atypical wolf that depredates on livestock. Most gray wolves don't. It is true that very few depredations occur on an annual basis. In Montana, for example, my state, on average, gray wolves will kill the 800 so gray wolves that live in Montana will kill on average about 50 head of cattle and about 75 head of sheep on an annual basis out of well over 1 million sheep and cattle that occur in the state of Montana. So in other words, we know that wolf depredations on livestock are not a threat to the industry. That said, we also know that when a rancher suffers depredations, it's a problem. You bet it is, and it needs to be fixed. Fortunately, we've got very good tools at the ready for resolving conflicts when they arise, and very good tools at the ready for preventing conflicts from ever occurring in the first place. We can put an astronaut on the moon and bring her back. We can take your heart out of your chest and put it back better than before. I promise you, we can find easy ways to coexist with gray wolves and livestock. It's really just a question of will.
So I'd like to add in there that we would prefer to avoid the conflict in the first place. We don't want to see ranchers lose any of their livestock, even if it's only 1 or 2 or 3.
Yes.
We want to avoid that conflict. And so what we can point to is, 25 years of figuring out in the Northern Rockies how to coexist. And there are so many good examples of ranchers, sheep and cattle ranchers up in the Northern Rockies that have developed strategies that we can absolutely apply here in Colorado to make the rancher whole, to avoid conflict, and actually make the range healthier. So what we've seen and what we've observed and what has been worked on intensively up in the Northern Rockies is ways to change cattle behavior. You know, you're not going to change the behavior of the wolf, they're going to go, but we can change the behavior of the cattle, and there are people that are really very expert at making that happen. We can change, we can use some old tried and true strategies like livestock guard dogs. We can avoid the conflict. We don't have to be sheep. We can change our behaviors, and we can make this happen. I think Colorado can be a shining example of how to do it differently so that we don't lose wolves and we don't lose livestock. And we can do this. We see in the research that Coloradans have a different attitude towards wildlife. They believe in their hearts that we need to coexist, that wildlife, including large carnivores, are an important part of our natural ecosystem and want to learn how to, and we can. We just need to implement strategies that have already been developed.
Dave, Delia makes a beautiful point. It's not just from the Northern Rockies. There's quite a few livestock operators in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan. There's livestock operators in European countries where gray wolves are common. This isn't being proposed for the first time. This being the acceptance of coexistence isn't being proposed for the first time in Colorado. It's being achieved every day around the world.
And just for an apples to apples comparison, we know from the Northern Rocky Mountains where cattle and sheep are essentially ranched the same way they are in Colorado. that 99.95% of those cows and sheep are not killed by wolves. If they're sharing sharing the landscape with wolves, 99.95% of them are never killed by wolves. So nonetheless, even though this is a tiny problem in the economic scheme of things, we know that those individual instances can hurt a ranching operation. And so we built into Proposition 114 language that directs the state to ensure that depredations are properly investigated and properly paid for at fair market value.
Yeah, and Rob, Dave, I want to make a very important point that goes back to what Rob just said and Delia's comments earlier about ballot box biology. Proposition 114 was very carefully constructed to acknowledge the importance of science. Consequently, it doesn't provide many details about how a restoration project would go forward. It was the architects of 114's decision that those details should be decided by the biologists at Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There was one exception where 114 is specific. And it specifically says Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the wolf restoration effort will move forward with respect for ranchers. There will be a program in place to account for problems they might incur. Otherwise, 114 is pretty open-ended as an aspirational goal, accepting this insistence that ranchers be properly accounted for. Now, to some extent, 114 did that because ranchers are important. And secondarily, the architects of 114 knew, as Delia just pointed out, there are good solutions out there for ensuring that depredations never occur, that coexistence is a very practical path forward.
Wow, this is really fascinating. Now, I'm guessing that reintroducing wolves in Colorado isn't going to keep the population of Texans and Californians down, is it?
No, wolves represent no threat to human safety. No, that's a burden you'll have to figure out on your own.
And I'm afraid it might actually attract some.
But I thought that was kind of a funny segue into, well, what about, we've talked about livestock, we've talked about wildlife. I think we've checked the box on ecosystem health, but if there's anything else we want to mention there, we can. But just what about Coloradans? What are they going to see that's different?
Well, they'll be able to hike and enjoy wolf country, which is a magical place. The heart and soul of wildness is the howl of the wolf. It's this fantastic call to a past that needs to be part of our future as we recognize the importance of wild and self-willed nature and ecological settings that are intact, that they will benefit mightily in a spiritual sense. They may benefit mightily in an experiential sense if they're out hiking and they're treated to hear wolves howl or see a wolf flash across the trail. There's great benefits to hiking in wolf country. It's as God intended if you're a person of faith. It's as nature intended if you're a secular humanist. And then in terms of the one other aspect of recreation, Dave, that needs to be considered, gray wolves and big game hunting. We know from decades of work from the Great Lakes states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, the northern Rocky Mountains, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, gray wolves and big game hunting get along just fine. There's great big game hunting opportunities in the Great Lakes states. There's great big game hunting opportunities in the northern Rocky Mountains, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Often with gray wolves in place, still report record seasons, grand opportunities to hunt deer and elk in the three states. There is no reason to believe that restoring gray wolves to Colorado will upset the big game hunting apple cart. It really is a case where everybody that opposes wolves are mostly motivated by the mythical wolf. This sense that the wolf has a supernatural ability to exercise its predatory will on a whim. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The real wolf is not even a shadow of its mythical self. And yet, unfortunately, the myth is as strong as it is wrong. What the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project and more recently the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund has intended to do is help Coloradans embrace an honest portrayal of the gray wolf. If you do that, it's fair to conclude that coexisting with the species is a relatively straightforward affair that requires only a modicum of accommodation.
So I'd like to tie in a couple of concepts that Rob and Mike have brought to in Colorado, and I'm sure many Western states, our absolute love and celebration of wilderness with a big W. When we look at the Wilderness Act, it celebrates landscapes that have their full complement of life, that are intact, that are functioning. If we think about the concept in Colorado, boy, one of the first wilderness areas designated was right here in my backyard, the Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness Area in 1964. But those wilderness areas haven't had wolves. They haven't had their full complement of wildlife, and wildlife, a keystone species that is so essential to the functioning of wilderness as wilderness was envisioned. Returning wolves to wilderness will make wilderness complete. And boy, would I love to hike in my backyard wilderness with wolves howling in the distance. We haven't seen wolves attacking people in Yellowstone National Park, where there's a couple of million visitors that go camping in tents. That wolves, boy, you know, it's the exactly opposite. Wolves are afraid of us for good reason. We're the ones that exterminated them. They have lots to fear from us. We have really nothing to fear from them. Now, that's not to say that it hasn't happened. There's 40 to 60,000 or so wolves up in Alaska and Canada, and Alaska Parks and Wildlife could document in the last 100 years 2 times where human life was lost to wolves. Only 2 in the last 100 plus years, with 40 to 60,000 wolves on the ground. So yes, there's always risk. You can't say there's not, but the risk is so minimal that I personally am not worried about it, and I'm not hugely big and burly to necessitate fighting off critters.
The human safety aspect is clear from what you've listed for Yellowstone, Delia, and you know the numbers for Alaska need to reflect the reality of the situations that led up to those incidents, and at least one of those was somebody being a stupid human by feeding and habituating the wolf or wolves and getting into problems. So we have to respect them as wild animals with big teeth and claws. And if we treat them like that, everybody will get along fine.
Yeah, you don't even, I mean, I understand people's fears are powerful, and they may be irrational, but they're powerful nonetheless. But Dave, if you look at the history of gray wolves and people, you go back 10,000 years, 15,000 years, back to a hunter-gatherer roots during the Pleistocene, there's clear evidence that gray wolves and humans had a very close collegial symbiotic relationship. It's very clear that gray wolves were the first domesticated animal. Now, it takes a long time to go from a gray wolf to a Chihuahua, but nonetheless, in a functional sense, they were domesticated. They were part of these bands of hunter-gatherers. The wolves benefited, the people benefited, and that is the notion of domestication of animals. We had a very close collegial, mutually beneficial relationship with gray wolves for thousands of years. They don't see us as something to hurt. They just don't. It's interesting, you know, you look at the origins of the domestic dog, they didn't come out of coyotes. They didn't come out of foxes. Coyotes and foxes just see the world differently. They came out of gray wolves. Gray wolves see us as a brother and a sister more often than not. We've taken that willingness on their part and used it to their great disadvantage. Coloradans have a chance to use it otherwise.
Yep.
Wow, that's fascinating. Fascinating. I want to give each of you a chance to kind of wrap it up with why you personally support restoring wolves to Colorado. But before we do that, is there any subject area that we've missed that we need to quickly work in?
It is important for Coloradans, especially in this time of the pandemic, to understand that wolf restoration is not a mechanically difficult thing to do. It's not a scientifically difficult thing to do. It's been done before. Additionally, it's not an expensive thing to do. The programs that have been conducted elsewhere that I've been honored to lead are not expensive endeavors. It's not tens of millions of dollars every year. That's not the case. We also know that given that the gray wolf is protected under federal law, there would be federal support available to help offset the cost of the restoration effort in Colorado. It's not something that has to be assumed by just Coloradans. The public at large across this great country could be involved. It is noteworthy that the landscape of relevance to wolf restoration is the vast federal public wildlands of Western Colorado. As a Montanan, I have every right to concern myself with the White River National Forest in Colorado. It's my national forest too. Moreover, the gray wolf is protected, as I said, under federal law. Consequently, I'm guided by federal law as a Montanan. It's of concern to me that the gray wolf is protected under my federal law. This is not something that Coloradans have to do on their own in terms of the financial expectations of the cost of the program. There will be federal support, but this is a grand opportunity for Coloradans to rise up, do something historic, build a program by Coloradans for Coloradans to find a way forward for the gray wolf in the vast public wildlands of Western Colorado to restore the balance. That's exciting. That's historic. That's the right thing to do.
Wow, Mike Phillips, I think you ought to run for office.
Yeah, well, I'm still, actually, you might be surprised, I'm still a state senator. Anyway, I'll succeed my seat in early January 2021. But this is a great issue, and Coloradans, this is grown out of Colorado soil. It's being led by Coloradans. I'm honored to serve as a small voice among many as an advisor, but it is a Colorado-baked effort, and it will be decided by Coloradans in about, oh gee whiz, I want to say about 63 days.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, I'd like to give each of you a chance to make your final case. Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll go first. I'm not bashful. It's the right thing to do. Vote how yes on Proposition 114. Restore the wolf. Restore the balance.
Through all my wanderings across the western slope of Colorado, I have seen beautiful landscapes. I have seen lots of elk. I've seen lots of deer. But I've also seen landscapes that are missing a critical piece, that aspect of those ecosystems are wolves. These are our public lands. We deserve a voice in what happens to these lands and the lands with their critters, with all of their critters. I miss hearing that howl on those public lands. I miss seeing those lands restored. I miss the birds that will come back. I know that if we can manage those lands with the full suite of critters that have evolved here over decades, over thousands of years, we will see a different Colorado. We can restore the connections, not just between the critters and the land, but between us and the land. And that can go a very long way to restoring a relationship that we've lost long ago. So restoring that relationship between humans and the land and between humans and wolves can occur if we vote yes on Proposition 114, how yes, and restore the balance by restoring wolves.
Thanks, Delia. I believe that the 25 years that I've been working towards this historic moment with Mike, with you, Delia, with many of our coalition partners, makes sense. And it makes sense that it's happening now in the midst of one of the most frightening, troubling times that modern people have seen, and yet one of the most hope-filled times that we've seen as well. Asking the people of Colorado to say yes to Proposition 114, to say yes to restoring wolves is really timely, because wolves were oppressed by a paradigm that is bygone, that only remnants now make wolves evil. Wolves are not evil. Wolves are necessary to the landscape and necessary to our souls. Our grandchildren and great grandchildren are expecting us to get this right, and I fully expect that we will.
Thank you, Rob Edward, Mike Phillips, and Delia Malone for your expertise and your insights on wolf restoration to Colorado. Proposition 114 provides Coloradans with an opportunity to reclaim their natural heritage, to restore a natural balance by restoring gray wolves to Colorado. Around the world, biodiversity is crashing due to human activities. This is our opportunity to reverse those losses, to restore a compassionate relationship with the natural world, to pass on a Colorado that is wild and intact with its full suite of native wildlife for future generations to enjoy. This is our opportunity to begin the restoration by restoring gray wolves to Colorado's 17 million acres of public wildlands. For more information, you can visit Colorado Wolves FAQ CHCC. We'll include a link in the show notes, but you can just search for Colorado Wolves FAQ in your browser and you'll find that. It's a website developed at Colorado State University by the Center for Human and Carnivore Coexistence. Pikes Peak Group of Sierra Club partners with several area environmental groups to produce the Peak Environment Podcast at Studio 809 Podcasts. The Pikes Peak Group is part of the Colorado chapter of Sierra Club and represents members in the greater Pikes Peak region and beyond. The club invites you to join its events, hikes, and discussions. For more information about the group's activities and events, follow Pikes Peak Group of the Sierra Club on Facebook. I'll provide links in the show notes so that you can dig deeper into any of the things that we've talked about. And I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.